High in the shadowed ridges of the Carpathian Mountains, where mist clings to the pines like a shroud and the wind carries whispers of forgotten centuries, there existed a family that history almost entirely forgot. Unlike other villages and clans documented in official records, their births were never registered, their deaths never marked, their existence barely acknowledged beyond the faint murmurs of the few who crossed paths with them. To the casual observer, they were merely another rural family, eking out a life in the unforgiving terrain of Eastern Europe. But to those who dared to delve deeper, they were something altogether different, a lineage shrouded in secrecy, isolation, and patterns of inbreeding so extreme that it left indelible marks on their bodies, minds, and the stories that surrounded them. The first accounts of the family reached the ears of traveling priests and minor officials, men whose duties brought them into the mountains for record-keeping, taxation, or religious rites. Yet every report they wrote only deepened the mystery. They described children with unusual physical features, adults who behaved in ways that seemed both cunning and animalistic, and a household operating under rules and rhythms that no outsider could fully comprehend. There were hints of rituals, of secrecy, of a strict internal hierarchy enforced by the weight of generations, but these details were always sketchy, half-remembered, or couched in superstition. What was certain, however, was that official documents, birth certificates, baptismal records, marriage registrations, simply did not exist. In the eyes of the outside world, this family had been born from the mist itself, their lives invisible to history. It was not only the lack of documentation that set them apart. Their very homes seemed to resist the touch of civilization. Nestled in a remote valley accessible only by narrow, treacherous paths, the family's dwelling appeared abandoned to the untrained eye. Roofs sagged under decades of snow and neglect, wooden walls were blackened by smoke and weather, and gardens that might have fed the family were overgrown with wild plants and thorny brambles. Travelers who stumbled upon this hidden enclave reported a silence almost unnatural in its intensity, a stillness broken only by distant, guttural voices that echoed through the mountains. Even the animals of the region avoided the area, as if sensing something in the family that defied the ordinary laws of nature. Despite their isolation, the family could not escape the scrutiny of outsiders entirely. Local villagers told tales of children who walked with a strange, loping gait, of siblings who looked more like cousins than brothers and sisters, of voices carrying words in a dialect that was almost, but never quite, understandable. Rumors spread of deformities, of peculiar habits, of a household that seemed internally governed by a logic all its own. Some spoke in hushed tones of a cursed lineage, while others insisted it was simply a survival mechanism in a place so harsh that outsiders could not hope to understand. Yet what scholars, priests, and travelers alike could not deny was that the family had endured for generations, adapting, reproducing, and surviving in ways that defied conventional explanations. The question that immediately arises is how a family could exist so fully yet leave virtually no trace in historical records. In early 19th century Carpathia, the act of recording births, deaths, and marriages was far from universal. Mountainous terrain, poor roads, and scattered settlements made it difficult for any central authority to maintain accurate records. Still, the complete absence of documentation for this particular family is extreme even by these standards. Some historians have speculated that the family deliberately avoided registration, perhaps out of distrust of outsiders or fear of interference. Others have suggested that local authorities, already struggling to maintain control over a rugged, rebellious region, may have simply ignored them. Whatever the cause, the result is a gap in history, a family whose existence is known largely through anecdote, rumor, and the occasional surviving document that only hints at their story. It is in this absence that the family's legend begins to take shape. Humans are naturally drawn to the unknown, and the more elusive something is, the more our imaginations fill in the blanks. In the case of this Carpathian family, the lack of official records transformed them from a rural household into something almost mythic. They became a symbol of isolation, of the extremes of human adaptation, and of the dangers and curiosities of inbreeding within closed communities. For outsiders, the family was simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. Travelers described the uncanny precision with which the household operated, the way children resembled each other so closely that one could not tell them apart, and the subtle, almost imperceptible signals that governed every interaction. It was as if the family had created its own world, one with rules, customs, and behaviors incomprehensible to anyone not born within its walls. Yet behind the layers of myth and speculation lies a story grounded in the stark realities of survival. Life in the Carpathians was harsh. Winters were long and brutal, food was scarce, and illness often claimed the weak. In such conditions, any family that survived multiple generations had to be resourceful, resilient, and deeply bonded. For this family, those bonds were amplified to an extreme degree. Intermarriage within the lineage was not merely a choice but a necessity imposed by isolation, limited mobility, and the absence of other nearby families. While the genetic consequences of such practices are well documented today, at the time they would have been viewed through the lens of practicality and cultural continuity. It is likely that the family understood, at some level, the risks involved, but survival took precedence over any theoretical considerations of health or heredity. As the story of this family emerges, one is confronted not only with questions of biology and sociology but also with the darker, more human aspects of secrecy and shame. There is a certain discomfort in staring at a lineage so tightly bound by blood, a realization that the very mechanisms of survival may produce outcomes that we instinctively recoil from. Outsiders who encounter the family often described a mix of fear and fascination, noting the strange behaviors, the physical similarities, and the subtle but unmistakable sense that the family existed in a different moral and social universe. These encounters, recorded in letters, journals, and early ethnographic studies, provide the only glimpses we have into a household that deliberately, or perhaps unconsciously, kept the world at arm's length. And yet, despite their isolation and the myths that grew around them, the family story is not one of mere horror. It is a story of endurance, adaptation, and the complex interplay between human biology and culture. It challenges our assumptions about normalcy, about the boundaries of community, and about what it means to survive in a world that seems determined to erase you. In their silence and secrecy, in their absence from official records, the family leaves us with a haunting question. How much of human history is hidden in plain sight, waiting only for those bold enough, or foolish enough, to uncover it? In the shadowed valleys of the Carpathians, the wind continues to sweep through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of a family that time almost forgot. They remain, in memory and in legend, a testament to the extremes of human existence, the mysteries of isolated bloodlines, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden not in grand archives or official documents, but in the unrecorded lives of those who dared to live outside the reach of history. The Carpathian Mountains have long been a region of extremes, where the landscape itself seems to shape the lives of those who inhabit it. Towering peaks rise sharply into the clouds, cloaked in dense forests that are thick with mist and shadow, and deep valleys cut by rivers that glisten like silver threads through the jagged terrain. In the early 19th century, this was a land largely untouched by the sweeping changes of industrialization and modernization that were beginning to transform other parts of Europe. Travel was arduous, roads were often little more than narrow dirt tracks barely wide enough for a horse, and the settlements were scattered, isolated, and fiercely self-reliant. In such a setting, life was harsh, brutal, and unyielding, and those who called these mountains home had little choice but to adapt to the unforgiving rhythms of nature. For most communities, survival depended on a delicate balance between agriculture, hunting, and trade. Crops struggled to grow in the rocky soil, winters were long and merciless, and even a minor illness could prove fatal in a place where access to doctors or hospitals was almost impossible. Villages relied heavily on each other for mutual support, but they also clung fiercely to their traditions, their customs, and their beliefs. This adherence to local culture was not mere superstition. It was a necessary framework that guided daily life, ensured social cohesion, and provided explanations for the inexplicable events that frequently occurred in such an isolated environment. Mountains, after all, have a way of bending human understanding, making small disasters seem monumental, and turning everyday life into something that outsiders often found alien or incomprehensible. The remoteness of the Carpathians meant that official authorities had only a limited presence in the region. Clergy traveled from village to village, registering births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths, but many families lived far from parishes and often avoided contact with priests altogether. Taxes were inconsistently collected, records were poorly maintained, and disputes over property or inheritance were resolved locally rather than by formal legal systems. In this context, a family could easily exist on the periphery of official documentation, particularly if they deliberately avoided contact with outsiders or were viewed by their neighbors as different. This combination of geographical isolation and weak administrative oversight created the conditions for anomalies to arise. Households that left virtually no trace in written history yet endured for generations in plain sight. Cultural norms in the Carpathians were equally influential in shaping the behavior and survival strategies of isolated families. Villages adhered to strict codes of kinship, marriage, and social hierarchy, often enforced by both custom and communal pressure. Outsiders, whether government officials or traveling merchants, were treated with caution. Stories circulated of strangers disappearing into the forests or returning with tales of bizarre encounters, and these anecdotes only reinforced a sense of collective vigilance among local communities. Within this context, a family that kept to themselves, married only within their lineage, and maintained secrecy about births or deaths was not merely unusual. It was a calculated adaptation to the environment, a strategy for maintaining autonomy in a world where external interference could be dangerous or fatal. Religious and superstitious beliefs further shaped perceptions of isolated families. Many mountain communities held a dual worldview, blending orthodox Christian teachings with older folk traditions, rituals, and omens. Villagers interpreted the world around them not only through scripture but also through the lens of folklore, attributing unexplained phenomena to curses, spirits, or divine retribution. A family whose children were born with unusual features, whose behavior deviated from the norm, or whose members lived longer or shorter than expected was easily woven into the fabric of these local legends. Outsiders might have recorded them clinically, but locals often spoke of them in hushed tones, describing them as cursed, blessed, or simply other. In a place where survival was tenuous and the margin between life and death razor-thin, the blending of fact and folklore was not merely storytelling, it was a tool for understanding, explaining, and, in some cases, controlling the unknown. Geography also played a critical role in shaping isolation. The Carpathians are a labyrinth of steep slopes, hidden valleys, and dense forests that are almost impenetrable during winter months. Villages were often self-contained, with their own water sources, pastures, and defensive structures. Travel between settlements was slow and dangerous, particularly for those unfamiliar with the terrain. Avalanches, sudden storms, and treacherous cliffs made movement perilous, and families that settled in particularly remote areas could go for months, or even years, without encountering outsiders. This geographical isolation had profound consequences for the social and genetic makeup of these communities. Inbreeding, repeated intermarriage within the same kin groups, and limited access to new genetic material became unavoidable realities, shaping both the physical characteristics and social behaviors of isolated families. The combination of extreme isolation, harsh environmental pressures, and deeply ingrained cultural practices created a society in which secrecy was not only possible but sometimes essential. Families who lived on the edge of maps and official oversight could hide births, deaths, and marriages without drawing attention, especially if their neighbors were similarly remote or reluctant to interfere. These conditions also made them highly self-sufficient, capable of producing their own food, constructing their own homes, and raising their children without reliance on external authorities. In such circumstances, the boundaries between family and community blurred, and the internal rules of the household often took precedence over regional norms or laws. This environment helps explain why a family could exist in the Carpathians for generations without leaving formal documentation. Their story was shaped not by negligence but by necessity. Survival demanded self-reliance, secrecy, and adherence to internal codes. A family that remained hidden from official oversight could continue its lineage unobserved, maintaining its genetic and cultural traits with little interference. Over time, this created patterns that outsiders would later interpret as strange, unnatural, or even sinister. Children born within these households might resemble each other with uncanny similarity. Adults might behave in ways that seemed alien, and behaviors shaped by internal logic rather than external law could appear both fascinating and disturbing to those who encountered them. Even today, the Carpathians retain an air of mystery. The mountains are not merely a backdrop to human activity, they are an active participant in shaping it. Valleys obscure entire settlements, forests conceal centuries of history, and the sheer difficulty of access has historically allowed traditions, families, and secrets to persist almost untouched by outside influence. It is in this landscape that the family at the center of our story thrived, hidden from view, subject to the laws of nature and necessity rather than those of the state. Their isolation was both their protection and their curse, allowing them to survive and reproduce while simultaneously creating conditions that would result in genetic, social, and behavioral anomalies that outsiders would struggle to comprehend. Understanding this historical and geographical context is crucial to grasping the family story. It explains not only how they could remain unrecorded but also why their behaviors, traits, and survival strategies developed as they did. The Carpathians were more than a setting, they were a crucible, a force that shaped every aspect of life, from birth to death, from custom to folklore. The family existed in a delicate balance between isolation and survival, myth and reality, obscurity and endurance, and it is only by appreciating the full weight of these environmental and cultural factors that we can begin to unravel the mystery of a lineage that time itself seemed to overlook. The discovery of the family in the Carpathian Mountains was, by all accounts, accidental. Travelers, priests, and minor officials who ventured into these remote valleys often did so out of necessity, following narrow, treacherous paths to reach settlements barely marked on any map. Some were sent to collect taxes, others to register births and deaths, and a few, braver or perhaps more curious, sought to study the region's unusual customs. It was during one such journey that a priest, crossing a ridge after a storm, first glimpsed the family's dwelling, a cluster of weathered wooden cabins nestled in a hidden hollow, surrounded by dense forest and near impassable undergrowth. From a distance, the buildings appeared abandoned, the smoke from chimneys thin and pale, as though reluctant to rise into the sky. Yet movement within the shadows, the flicker of human figures, and the distant echo of voices revealed that life persisted in isolation, entirely untouched by the surrounding world. Initial reports described the family with a mixture of fascination, disbelief, and unease. The children moved with a curious coordination, resembling one another to a degree that outsiders found unsettling. Observers noted odd features, high foreheads paired with sunken eyes, unusually small or large bodies, and expressions that seemed both calculated and instinctively aware, as though the family had developed its own internal language of gestures and signals. Adults behaved in ways that defied conventional understanding, sometimes showing sudden bursts of aggression or extreme caution, other times displaying a unity and cooperation that was almost telepathic. Outsiders were left with the sense that they were witnessing a social experiment conducted over generations, a household governed not by the familiar rules of society but by its own internal logic, developed under the pressures of isolation and necessity. The family's composition was initially difficult to ascertain. Names were inconsistent, ages were unclear, and the absence of any formal records made it nearly impossible to reconstruct a reliable genealogy. Priests attempted to trace their lineage through oral histories, speaking with neighbors who claimed to have known the family for decades, only to encounter conflicting accounts, half-forgotten details, and outright fabrications. The family itself contributed to the confusion, speaking in a dialect that was heavily influenced by local speech but peppered with idiosyncrasies unique to their own household. Even when the priest or visitor thought they understood a person's relationship to another, the logic often unraveled under closer scrutiny. Children who appeared to be siblings were sometimes described by the family as cousins, and adults who seemed like parents occasionally claimed a more distant connection. This uncertainty only added to the aura of mystery, as it became clear that the family had intentionally obscured its history, either out of self-preservation, fear, or a deeply ingrained cultural habit of secrecy. Observers were particularly struck by the family's remarkable cohesion and the unusual social structure within the household. Roles appeared to be strictly defined, with older members exercising a quiet but absolute authority over younger generations. Tasks were divided with precision. Some cultivated the garden, others tended animals, and still others maintained the cabins, hunted, or collected wood. Despite their extreme isolation, the family functioned with a remarkable efficiency, each member anticipating the needs of the others, responding to subtle cues, and maintaining a system of internal order that outsiders could not penetrate. This efficiency was not merely practical. It carried a sense of ritual, of long-established rules passed down through generations, and it was reinforced by a discipline that bordered on the obsessive. Those who encountered the family often described a chilling sense that they were intruding on a world governed by entirely different laws, one where outsiders were unwelcome observers rather than participants. The family's behaviors extended beyond domestic routines. Observers noted unusual customs and practices, particularly surrounding childbirth, child-rearing, and marriage. Children were sometimes raised communally, with multiple adults responsible for their training, discipline, and survival skills. Births were kept secret or minimally acknowledged, and outsiders were rarely permitted to witness them. Marriage patterns were similarly controlled, with repeated intermarriage among closely related family members ensuring the preservation of internal cohesion and genetic continuity. To modern eyes, these practices suggest a calculated attempt to maintain both social and biological control, but in the historical context of 1827, they were likely motivated by necessity, tradition, and the imperatives of survival in an environment that offered little room for error. There were also reports of physical anomalies that seemed to mark generations of inbreeding, though contemporary observers lacked the scientific understanding to interpret them fully. Some children were described as unusually small or large for their age, others with facial features so alike that distinguishing between siblings was nearly impossible. There were mentions of health conditions that appeared to recur with disturbing regularity, vision problems, unusual gait, susceptibility to illness, but without proper documentation, the patterns remained speculative. Even so, these accounts contributed to the sense that the family existed on the margins of human normality, a lineage shaped by isolation, necessity, and internal logic rather than by the broader social and genetic norms of the region. The reactions of outsiders were complex, a mixture of awe, horror, and fascination. Traveling officials and priests often recorded the family in private journals, careful to separate observable facts from hearsay, but their language betrayed their unease. Words like uncanny, strange, and unnatural appeared repeatedly, suggesting both a recognition of difference and an instinctive fear of it. Locals, for their part, treated the family with a combination of superstition and respect. Some believed the family possessed unusual powers, whether spiritual insight, physical resilience, or a form of cunning intelligence that allowed them to survive where others could not. Others whispered of curses or divine punishment, interpreting the family's anomalies through the lens of folklore rather than biology. In either case, the family's existence provoked strong emotional reactions, underscoring the tension between human curiosity and fear, fascination, and moral judgment. Despite, or perhaps because of, these reactions, the family remained fiercely private. Outsiders who attempted to enter the household were often rebuffed or observed from a distance, and even casual interactions were limited to what was necessary for trade or survival. In many ways, the family's secrecy was a form of protection, a way of maintaining autonomy in a world that might not understand or accept them. It also reinforced the cycle of myth and reality, as limited exposure combined with striking physical and behavioral traits ensured that stories about the family became exaggerated over time, blending fact and fiction into a narrative that continues to captivate historians, anthropologists, and curious minds to this day. Over time, the cumulative accounts of these early observers began to coalesce into a portrait of the family that is both chilling and compelling. Here was a lineage that had persisted for generations, largely invisible to official history, yet leaving a profound imprint on the collective memory of the region. Their survival was remarkable, their social cohesion almost impenetrable, and their physical and behavioral traits striking enough to make outsiders question the boundaries of human normality. They embodied the extremes of adaptation, the consequences of isolation, and the enduring human fascination with the unknown. To this day, the family is remembered not through records or monuments but through fragments of stories, brief observations, and the lingering echo of a life lived entirely outside the reach of conventional society. In the remote valleys of the Carpathians, where mist hides paths and the wind carries whispers of the past, they remain a haunting example of how history can obscure, how isolation can shape identity, and how human beings can endure, adapt, and mystify across generations. Their discovery was not merely the finding of a family, it was the unveiling of a human enigma, a living testament to the extremes of isolation, secrecy, and survival in one of Europe's most remote and unforgiving landscapes. One of the most perplexing and enduring aspects of this Carpathian family is the complete absence of formal birth, baptismal, marriage, or death records. In an era when even the most remote villages generally maintained at least minimal documentation through parish registries, this family seemed to exist entirely outside the purview of official authority. To a historian or genealogist, such an absence is almost unimaginable, a lineage that appears simultaneously fully realized and yet untraceable, as if the mountains themselves had conspired to erase it from the annals of human record. The implications of this are profound, not only for understanding the family itself but also for contemplating the fragility of historical memory and the countless other stories that may have been lost to time. The reasons behind this lack of documentation are multifaceted, a combination of geographical isolation, deliberate concealment, and the limits of bureaucratic oversight. The family resided in a region where roads were treacherous, winters harsh, and travel for priests or government officials extremely difficult. Villages that were officially recorded were often only partially accessible, and in many cases, officials relied on local intermediaries or sporadic visits to collect data. A family living in a hidden hollow, surrounded by dense forests and steep cliffs, could avoid registration simply by remaining out of reach, interacting only when absolutely necessary. Yet even considering these logistical challenges, the total absence of records across multiple generations suggests something more than mere happenstance. Local oral traditions hint at intentional secrecy, a deliberate avoidance of contact with outsiders that may have been passed down from one generation to the next. Within the family, births were rarely announced, marriages quietly conducted, and deaths acknowledged only within the household. This culture of concealment served multiple purposes. It protected the family from potential exploitation, ensured their autonomy in a world that might not accept them, and reinforced internal cohesion by keeping knowledge of lineage and inheritance tightly controlled. To an outsider, these practices might appear unnatural or suspicious, but in the context of isolation and survival, they represent a sophisticated system of self-preservation. The absence of records has created enormous challenges for modern historians attempting to piece together the family's genealogy. Researchers rely on fragmentary evidence, second-hand accounts from neighbors, diaries, or letters of officials who visited the region, and occasional church records noting encounters with unidentified or vaguely described households. These documents often conflict, creating a mosaic of uncertainty where no definitive conclusions can be drawn. Names are inconsistent, ages approximate, and relationships difficult to confirm. Even within the oral histories preserved by villagers, stories vary dramatically, reflecting both the passage of time and the human tendency to embellish or distort memory. What emerges from these accounts is less a factual record and more a portrait of a family defined by its elusiveness, a lineage that resists classification and refuses to be pinned down by conventional methods of historical inquiry. The consequences of this missing documentation extend beyond the historical record. They also have implications for understanding the family's genetic and social development. In a typical, well-documented community, births and marriages are regulated by social norms, legal structures, and religious oversight, which serve to maintain genetic diversity and social cohesion. In the absence of these checks, the family was able to reproduce largely within its own lineage, a practice that likely accelerated patterns of inbreeding and intensified the expression of both physical and behavioral traits. Accounts from early visitors suggest a striking similarity among siblings, repeated physical anomalies, and behaviors that seemed almost instinctual, as though the family had developed its own internal rules for survival and reproduction. The lack of records, therefore, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a key factor in understanding how the family evolved biologically, socially, and psychologically over successive generations. Attempts to reconstruct the family tree using surviving anecdotal evidence reveal a complex and sometimes disturbing pattern. Children were often described as resembling one another to an uncanny degree, with shared facial features, body types, and even gestures. Certain health conditions appeared repeatedly, from vision problems to skeletal deformities, though the limited and inconsistent observations make it impossible to verify these claims conclusively. Oral histories describe a household in which knowledge of parentage, birth order, and lineage was maintained internally but never shared with outsiders. This internal record-keeping may have been meticulous, but it was intentionally opaque to those beyond the family, ensuring that the household's true composition remained hidden even from those attempting to document it. Complicating matters further, the family's secrecy was reinforced by the surrounding community. Neighbors, themselves living in isolation, often treated the family with a mix of fear, respect, and superstition. Stories of curses, omens, or unusual powers associated with the family discouraged prying eyes and helped preserve their anonymity. Even when outsiders managed to observe or interact with the household, information was filtered, partial, and sometimes deliberately misleading. As a result, the family's genealogy is less a linear record and more a tangled web of interrelated individuals, generations overlapping in ways that defy standard categorization. This absence of documentation has inspired both fascination and speculation among modern scholars. Some have proposed that the family represents an extreme case of survival-driven isolation, demonstrating how human groups can maintain cohesion, identity, and reproduction entirely outside formal structures. Others suggest darker possibilities, that the family deliberately manipulated records, hid births, and controlled marriages to concentrate wealth, power, or genetic traits within the lineage. Whatever the explanation, the lack of evidence challenges our understanding of human society, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that entire chapters of history may exist entirely beyond the reach of conventional scholarship. Scientific perspectives provide additional context. Modern genetics confirms that repeated intermarriage within closed populations can produce highly visible physical and behavioral traits. In small, isolated groups, recessive genes are more likely to manifest, leading to patterns of similarity among siblings and repeated health anomalies. The family's secrecy, then, may have had the unintended consequence of intensifying these genetic outcomes, producing generations of individuals whose traits were both fascinating and disturbing to outsiders. The absence of formal records makes it impossible to quantify these effects precisely, but the anecdotal evidence suggests a lineage that developed in isolation according to its own internal logic, with little regard for the expectations of the wider world. Ultimately, the mystery of the missing records underscores the tension between human curiosity and the limits of historical knowledge. It reminds us that documentation is not merely a bureaucratic formality but a key tool for understanding the past. Without it, even the most remarkable stories risk being lost or distorted. The family of the Carpathian Mountains existed at the intersection of survival, secrecy, and isolation, a lineage whose very existence challenged the assumptions of outsiders and whose absence from official records magnified their mistake. Their story is one in which the gaps in knowledge are as telling as the fragments we possess, a puzzle that continues to captivate anyone who dares to peer into the shadows of history. In the end, the family's elusiveness is both their legacy and their enigma. They endured, reproduced, and adapted in ways that defy conventional explanation, leaving behind no official trace but an indelible imprint on the memory of the region. The absence of birth and death records is not a flaw in historical methodology. It is a window into the extraordinary conditions of life, survival, and secrecy in one of Europe's most remote and unforgiving landscapes. Through the lens of this missing documentation, we begin to understand the contours of a family whose story is defined not by what was recorded but by what was deliberately concealed, a lineage that remains a haunting testament to human resilience and the mysteries that can flourish in isolation. As the fragments of the family's existence begin to coalesce, a picture emerges of individuals bound together by blood, secrecy, and the harsh demands of mountain survival. Names are few and inconsistent, often varying depending on who recounted the tale. Ages are approximate, with children seeming older or younger than they actually were, and adults whose true years could only be guessed at by their weathered faces and the callus on their hands. Yet despite the scarcity of documentation, the impressions left by those who encountered them were vivid and unforgettable. Each member of the family carried the weight of generations in isolation, manifesting not only in physical appearance but in a series of behaviors, habits, and social dynamics that outsiders could barely comprehend. Children appeared almost identical to one another, as though they had been cast from the same mold. Observers described them with an unsettling precision: similar high foreheads, narrow or sunken eyes, pronounced cheekbones, and subtle quirks in posture and movement that repeated from one sibling to the next. Their voices, too, carried echoes of familiarity, with tonalities and rhythms that outsiders found uncanny. Even small gestures, like the tilt of a head or the way hands rested while walking, were mirrored across siblings. These physical and behavioral similarities were compounded by the family's rigorous internal training, a system by which each member learned to anticipate the needs, reactions, and moods of others. Outsiders often commented on the almost preternatural coordination within the household, as though the family communicated through an unspoken language, one developed over decades of shared experience and reinforced by the isolation of their environment. The adults in the family were equally striking, their presence commanding, even in moments of quiet. Older members seemed to carry both authority and knowledge, guiding younger generations with a combination of strict discipline and subtle manipulation. Tasks within the household were distributed with meticulous care, yet this organization extended beyond mere labor. It structured the family's entire existence. Children were assigned responsibilities at an early age, learning to hunt, gather, cook, and maintain the home with precision. Even play was regulated, with games and activities designed to reinforce social hierarchy, cooperation, and survival skills. These patterns created a self-contained microsociety, one that functioned according to internal rules rather than the broader norms of the surrounding villages. For outsiders, witnessing such a system was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, a glimpse into a world shaped entirely by isolation and necessity. Observers also noted peculiar behavioral traits that seemed to distinguish the family from neighboring communities. Members displayed unusual caution, often retreating at the approach of strangers, yet they could also exhibit sudden bursts of aggression when boundaries were perceived to be threatened. Emotional responses were unpredictable to outsiders, oscillating between intense affection within the family unit and detached wariness toward outsiders. There were reports of what could only be described as ritualistic behaviors, repeated patterns of movement, speech, or interaction that outsiders failed to understand but which seemed vital to the family's internal order. Some of these behaviors may have been adaptive, strategies to maintain cohesion and survival, but they also contributed to the perception of the family as strange, even otherworldly, by those who glimpsed them from a distance. The family's reproductive practices further reinforced both their cohesion and their distinctiveness. Intermarriage within the lineage was a recurring theme, with siblings or close cousins marrying to preserve the internal genetic pool. Modern genetic science can explain the likely consequences: increased expression of recessive traits, repeated physical anomalies, and heightened vulnerability to certain health conditions. Historical observers, lacking this knowledge, interpreted these patterns through a lens of superstition or horror. Children with unusually similar features, adults exhibiting physical idiosyncrasies, or health conditions recurring across generations were often seen as evidence of a curse, divine punishment, or some inexplicable anomaly. To the family, however, these marriages were pragmatic choices, strategies to maintain both social cohesion and survival in a landscape where options were limited and outsiders untrustworthy. The family's diet, habits, and interaction with the environment also reinforced their isolation and internal distinctiveness. They relied primarily on locally sourced foods, wild game, foraged plants, cultivated vegetables, and constructed shelters that blended seamlessly into the mountainous terrain. Visitors remarked on their frugality, resilience, and ingenuity in extracting sustenance from a landscape that was often unforgiving. Every member of the family, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, participated in survival tasks, learning skills that outsiders found remarkable, if not alarming. This degree of self-sufficiency contributed to the family's reputation as a singular entity, existing almost entirely independently of the surrounding society. Yet it was not only their survival skills that set the family apart, it was also the subtle psychological dynamics at play. Observers described adults who seemed both watchful and calculating, children who were remarkably disciplined and attuned to family routines, and an overarching system of unspoken rules governing every interaction. Emotional bonds were intense within the household but rigidly structured, creating a sense of unity that could quickly turn to tension if internal codes were breached. These patterns suggest a family deeply aware of the precariousness of their existence, one that had honed social behavior to maintain cohesion under conditions of extreme isolation and environmental stress. Despite, or perhaps because of, their isolation, the family attracted attention and speculation from neighboring villages. Local folklore described them as uncanny, invoking fear, admiration, or superstition. Tales circulated of children who displayed knowledge or skills beyond their years, of adults whose presence commanded attention, and of the household's uncanny ability to remain intact despite the harsh realities of mountain life. While some villagers expressed genuine fear, others treated the family with a reluctant respect, recognizing that their survival in the mountains required extraordinary resilience and discipline. In both cases, these accounts reinforced the family's enigmatic reputation and contributed to the enduring mystique that surrounds them today. The family's secrecy and self-containment extended even to communication with outsiders. Visitors attempting to engage with the household often found themselves carefully observed, their words and intentions scrutinized before any response was given. Children were taught to retreat or avoid strangers unless explicitly instructed otherwise, while adults controlled all interactions with precision. This deliberate opacity served both as a protective measure and as a mechanism to maintain the family's autonomy. Outsiders rarely gained more than a fragmentary understanding of the household, leaving them with a mix of awe, fear, and curiosity that would echo in reports and oral histories for generations. In essence, the family represents a microcosm of survival, adaptation, and human ingenuity, intensified to an almost unnatural degree. Their cohesion, physical and behavioral traits, and internal social dynamics are not simply anomalies. They are the product of centuries of isolation, environmental pressures, and deliberate cultural strategies. Yet they are also profoundly human, a testament to the lengths to which people will go to protect their lineage, maintain identity, and endure in a world that seems indifferent, if not hostile. The combination of these traits, physical similarity, unusual behaviors, intermarriage, secrecy, and extraordinary self-sufficiency, renders the family simultaneously fascinating and unsettling, a living enigma that challenges our understanding of normalcy, morality, and the boundaries of human adaptability. Even today, long after the family's existence has become a subject of historical reconstruction rather than direct observation, the echoes of their presence remain palpable. The stories passed down by villagers, the scattered observations recorded by officials, and the fragmented oral histories all converge to paint a picture of a household that defied conventional understanding. They were a family shaped by the mountains, by isolation, by necessity, and by the invisible threads of their own internal culture. They were, in every sense, a lineage apart, a family whose lives, behaviors, and very identities were crafted as much by secrecy and survival as by blood. The consequences of the family's isolation and intermarriage practices became increasingly apparent to the earliest observers, though at the time few could articulate what they were witnessing in scientific terms. Repeated unions within the lineage had, over generations, intensified certain physical traits and behavioral patterns, creating a group of individuals who were strikingly similar in appearance yet marked by subtle anomalies that outsiders found both fascinating and unsettling. The effects of inbreeding, as modern genetics would later confirm, are far-reaching, influencing not only visible features like facial structure, stature, and body composition, but also susceptibility to disease, cognitive traits, and even patterns of behavior. In the case of this Carpathian family, isolation acted as a magnifying lens, concentrating traits that might have been diluted in a larger, more genetically diverse population. Physical anomalies were perhaps the most immediately noticeable aspect. Travelers, priests, and later researchers frequently remarked on the uncanny resemblance among siblings and cousins. Foreheads, cheekbones, jawlines, and eye shapes repeated from one individual to the next with an almost mechanical precision. Certain health conditions appeared with alarming regularity. Vision problems, malformed joints, and dental irregularities were reported across multiple generations, and some individuals exhibited skeletal peculiarities that suggested both hereditary and environmental influences. While modern observers can attribute these traits to the predictable effects of long-term consanguinity, contemporary witnesses often interpreted them as signs of a curse, divine punishment, or other supernatural influence, reinforcing the family's reputation as eerie or unnatural. Behavioral traits were equally affected, though in ways subtler and more difficult to quantify. Children were unusually disciplined and highly attuned to the rhythms of household life, often anticipating the needs and actions of elders without explicit instruction. Adults displayed a combination of hypervigilance and remarkable cooperation, suggesting that survival pressures, combined with a limited gene pool, may have amplified tendencies toward conformity, caution, and social cohesion. Observers described the family as possessing an almost preternatural sense of coordination, whether in domestic tasks, hunting expeditions, or interactions among siblings. These behaviors likely served adaptive purposes, ensuring the group could function efficiently in a harsh and unforgiving environment, but to outsiders they contributed to a sense of unease and fascination. The psychological consequences of inbreeding in such a closed population are complex. Limited genetic diversity can increase the risk of certain cognitive and neurological conditions, sometimes manifesting as developmental delays, behavioral rigidity, or heightened emotional sensitivity. Early observers noted episodes of extreme attachment, unusual fear responses, or rigid adherence to internal rules, and while these behaviors were often framed in moral or mystical terms, modern interpretation suggests a mixture of genetic, environmental, and cultural factors at play. The family had, over generations, adapted psychologically to the pressures of isolation, creating patterns of behavior that reinforced survival but also made them appear alien to the surrounding communities. In essence, their psychology was shaped as much by necessity and heredity as by the unique cultural environment they inhabited. Nutrition and lifestyle further amplified these outcomes. Living in the remote Carpathians meant that access to diverse foods was limited, with diets heavily reliant on what could be foraged, hunted, or cultivated locally. Nutritional deficits, combined with physically demanding daily routines, may have interacted with genetic predispositions, influencing growth, strength, and susceptibility to disease. Seasonal deprivation, harsh winters, and frequent illness created additional stresses, which would have had a compounding effect across generations. Each individual was both a product of their genes and the environment, and in this isolated microcosm, the interplay between heredity and environment became particularly pronounced. In addition to physical and behavioral traits, the family's reproductive strategies played a key role in maintaining cohesion but also contributed to observable genetic effects. By marrying within the family, they ensured that property, knowledge, and lineage remained concentrated, preserving the internal structure that allowed the household to survive in isolation. Yet each successive generation reinforced the concentration of recessive genes, increasing the likelihood of both minor and severe hereditary conditions. Historical accounts hint at instances of congenital anomalies, unusual health patterns, and physical traits that reappeared predictably within the family. These outcomes were never recorded systematically, but the anecdotal evidence paints a picture of a lineage in which genetics and survival imperatives were intertwined in ways that fascinated outsiders while alarming them. The family's genetic homogeneity also had social consequences. With traits becoming more pronounced over generations, outsiders could immediately recognize members of the household, and internal cohesion was reinforced through a shared sense of identity that was both biological and cultural. Children grew up with an acute awareness of family structure, roles, and expectations, internalizing behaviors and attitudes that ensured conformity. This unity, while adaptive in the context of survival, made the family seem insular and mysterious, further discouraging outsiders from prying into their affairs. What might appear to be eccentricity or oddity was often an evolved response to environmental pressures and genetic constraints, a strategy that preserved the lineage in one of Europe's most unforgiving regions. Medical understanding of the time was, of course, limited. Observers interpreted recurring physical or behavioral anomalies through a combination of superstition, moral judgment, and limited empirical observation. Conditions that modern genetics can explain as predictable consequences of inbreeding were often framed as curses, divine wrath, or signs of unnatural lineage. Stories of uncanny resemblance, repeated deformities, or unusual behavior spread quickly, shaping the family's reputation far beyond the immediate valleys in which they lived. Folklore and oral histories amplified these accounts, adding layers of legend to a biological reality that was already extraordinary. Even today, the story of this family provides a remarkable case study in the effects of extreme isolation and genetic concentration. Modern anthropology and genetics allow us to trace patterns, predict outcomes, and understand the adaptive strategies that emerge in such contexts. The Carpathian family demonstrates how human beings can survive and adapt in conditions that would appear intolerable to outsiders, while also revealing the profound consequences of genetic isolation. Physical anomalies, behavioral patterns, and social cohesion are not merely curiosities. They are the direct outcomes of a lineage shaped by both environment and heredity, a living testament to the ways in which biology and circumstance intertwine. The interplay of inbreeding, isolation, and survival creates a narrative that is both scientific and haunting. Observers were struck not only by what the family looked like or how they behaved, but by the sense that they had been molded over generations into something entirely self-contained, functioning according to rules and imperatives that outsiders could never fully comprehend. The family story challenges assumptions about normalcy, morality, and human adaptability. It forces a confrontation with the darker edges of survival and the consequences of living entirely outside the conventional structures of society. In this sense, the Carpathian lineage is both a cautionary tale and a remarkable example of human resilience, a reminder that isolation can produce outcomes as extraordinary as they are unsettling. Ultimately, the inbreeding and genetic consequences of this family cannot be separated from the broader context of their existence. Geography, culture, secrecy, and necessity all converge to create conditions in which these patterns could emerge, persist, and intensify over generations. The family's physical traits, behavioral tendencies, and psychological characteristics were the product of both heredity and environment, and they reveal the profound ways in which human populations can adapt to extreme isolation. The Carpathian family, in all its strange, haunting complexity, stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of how bloodlines, environment, and culture can intersect to produce outcomes that both fascinate and unsettle those who encounter them. As the family persisted in the shadowed valleys of the Carpathians, their isolation and peculiar traits began to weave themselves into the fabric of local legend. To the villagers who lived in nearby settlements, the family was unlike any other household they had ever encountered. Their physical similarities, their unusual behaviors, and their extreme secrecy fueled tales that straddled the line between reality and myth. Stories of the family were shared in hushed voices around fires, in taverns, and in passing by shepherds tending flocks on distant ridges. Over time, these tales evolved into folklore, each retelling adding new layers of mystery, exaggeration, and moral caution. The family became not just a household but a symbol of the unknown, an entity that embodied both fear and fascination. The earliest accounts often emphasized the family's uncanny resemblance to one another. Children were described as mirror images, adults sharing traits so precisely that outsiders could not tell them apart without close inspection. This resemblance extended beyond mere appearance. Observers noted that mannerisms, speech patterns, and even small gestures were repeated across generations, giving the impression that the family was bound together not only by blood but by an almost ritualized way of moving and interacting with the world. In a society deeply attuned to the nuances of behavior, such uniformity was unnerving. Locals whispered that the family possessed knowledge or powers that were passed down not through books or instruction but through blood itself, a notion that blurred the line between biology and mysticism. Stories of the family's interactions with outsiders further fueled the legend. Travelers reported encounters in which children would vanish into the forest with startling agility, or adults would appear seemingly from nowhere to observe strangers before silently retreating. Some villagers claim to have seen members of the household performing what they described as strange rituals at dawn or dusk, gatherings that involved rhythmic movements, whispered chants, or symbolic gestures that outsiders could not decipher. Whether these accounts were accurate or exaggerated is impossible to confirm, but they contributed to the family's reputation as otherworldly, reinforcing a sense of awe and fear that surrounded their hidden valley. Local folklore also framed the family in moral and supernatural terms. Tales circulated that linked the family to curses, divine punishment, or mystical blessings, often portraying them as either morally compromised or spiritually gifted. Some villagers believed that the family's repeated intermarriage had invoked the wrath of higher powers, while others argued that their survival in such a harsh and isolated environment was proof of extraordinary favor or resilience. These dual narratives, fear and admiration, curse and blessing, reflect a broader cultural tendency to interpret the unfamiliar through a lens of morality and myth. In the absence of records or direct observation, legend filled the gaps left by history, turning a real family into something simultaneously human and mythical. Physical anomalies within the family became focal points of legend. Reports of unusual height, distinctive facial features, or recurring health conditions were often sensationalized, transforming biological reality into symbolic narrative. A child born with a strikingly elongated face might be described as part wolf or touched by spirits, while siblings who resembled one another too closely were said to be clones of the cursed bloodline. Villagers imbued these traits with meaning, connecting them to local superstitions about fate, heredity, and morality. In a community where the line between science and folklore was fluid, physical difference was interpreted as evidence of otherworldly influence, reinforcing the family's mystique and ensuring their story endured in the collective consciousness. Behavioral oddities added another layer to the family's legendary status. Outsiders observed extreme caution, preternatural coordination, and behaviors that seemed ritualized or symbolic. Children were unusually disciplined, anticipating the needs of adults in ways that appeared almost telepathic. Adults displayed rigid hierarchies, strict internal rules, and bursts of aggression or protective vigilance that made interaction dangerous for strangers. These behaviors were natural adaptations to isolation and survival pressures, yet in the retelling by villagers, they became proof of something more sinister or mystical. A simple act of defense against an intruder could be transformed into a story of a supernatural guardian, while coordinated household activity was interpreted as evidence of secret knowledge passed down through the bloodline. The family's isolation itself became a key component of the folklore. Their valley, accessible only by treacherous paths and hidden by dense forests, was described as almost magically concealed. Travelers and villagers alike spoke of mist that seemed thicker around the family's home, of sounds that were oddly muted, and of an uncanny stillness that pervaded the surrounding area. These environmental features became inseparable from the family's story, reinforcing the notion that they existed in a world apart, protected and perhaps even shaped by the mountains themselves. In the imagination of the surrounding communities, the landscape and the family were entwined, forming a single narrative of mystery, danger, and fascination. Religious interpretation played a significant role in shaping local perception. Clergy and devout villagers often viewed the family through a moralistic lens, interpreting their secrecy and unusual practices as evidence of sin, divine punishment, or demonic influence. Birth anomalies, recurring health problems, and internal cohesion were framed as signs of divine judgment or spiritual corruption. Conversely, some tales emphasized the family's resilience and survival as miraculous, suggesting that their isolation had allowed them to escape worldly corruption or divine retribution. This duality, fear and reverence, condemnation and admiration, ensured that the family occupied a unique place in the region's moral and narrative landscape. Over time, the family became a fixture in cautionary tales and oral histories. Parents warned children against wandering into the valley, invoking the family as a symbol of the dangers of curiosity and disobedience. Hunters and shepherds recounted encounters with the family, embellishing the story with each retelling. Even when actual contact was brief or insignificant, the narrative grew, shaped by imagination, fear, and the human desire to explain what is otherwise incomprehensible. In this way, the family's story transcended mere reality, becoming an enduring part of the cultural consciousness of the Carpathians. What emerges from these tales is a portrait of a family whose identity was inseparable from myth. They were defined as much by the stories told about them as by their actual behaviors, a lineage whose isolation amplified both physical and psychological traits into a form that outsiders could only interpret through legend. Their reality and the local imagination were intertwined, creating a narrative in which biology, behavior, environment, and superstition merged. The family's presence in folklore ensured that they would never be entirely forgotten, even in the absence of official records, and that the boundaries between history and myth, fact and imagination, would always remain blurred. In examining these legends, it becomes clear that the family's notoriety was not merely due to their physical traits or behaviors, but to the way those traits were interpreted, amplified, and transmitted by the surrounding community. The interplay between observation and imagination, fact and fear, created a story that was greater than the sum of its parts. The family became a symbol of isolation, adaptation, and the unknown, a living embodiment of the eerie, fascinating, and sometimes terrifying possibilities that arise when human beings exist on the margins of conventional society. Through the fog of history and folklore, the family endures in memory, both real and imagined. Their legend serves as a testament to the power of isolation, the fascination with difference, and the human tendency to mythologize what cannot be fully understood. They are remembered not for the details that can be verified, but for the aura of mystery, fear, and/or that surrounded their existence. In this way, the Carpathian family transcends ordinary historical record, inhabiting a space where reality and legend meet, leaving a haunting imprint that continues to captivate those who dare to explore the mountains and the shadows of human experience. Over the years, the family's existence inevitably drew the attention of outsiders, traveling officials, priests, and later, early scientists and anthropologists, each motivated by curiosity, duty, or the promise of discovery. Yet for those who approached the hidden valleys, contact was rarely straightforward. The family's isolation, honed over generations, was both a shield and a test. Outsiders quickly learned that mere proximity was not enough to unravel the secrets of a lineage so tightly controlled and fiercely guarded. Each encounter left behind fragmented records, anecdotal accounts, and impressions that were sometimes reliable, often tinged with fear, and occasionally outright sensationalized. Together, these accounts form the backbone of what is known about a family that otherwise left almost no trace in official history. The earliest encounters were often by necessity rather than design. Clergy tasked with registering births, deaths, or marriages would occasionally stumble upon the household, documenting what they could. These priests, trained in observation but not in modern science, recorded their experiences in private diaries or letters. They noted the family's uncanny resemblance to one another, their meticulous household routines, and the subtle but unmistakable signals of hierarchy and control within the home. Children were observed moving with remarkable coordination, anticipating the needs of adults in ways that seemed almost preternatural. Adults maintained rigid discipline, enforcing rules and expectations with a combination of authority and quiet intimidation. These observations, though limited, hinted at a society functioning by its own internal logic, one entirely insulated from external norms. Merchants and travelers also contributed to the early documentation of the family. In many accounts, they describe fleeting encounters, glimpses of figures in the forest, quick exchanges at the edges of fields, or sightings of the family tending to animals or performing domestic tasks. These brief interactions often left a lasting impression because of the family's unusual appearance and behaviors. Outsiders reported children with identical facial features, adults with exaggerated caution or alertness, and an overall air of unity that suggested an almost instinctive awareness among household members. Even in fleeting contact, the family communicated a clear message. Outsiders were tolerated only to the extent necessary, and intrusion beyond certain boundaries was not permitted. As the 19th century progressed, the family attracted attention from early anthropologists and naturalists, drawn not merely by curiosity but by a desire to study human variation, heredity, and social structures in isolated populations. These scholars approached the family with a mixture of scientific rigor and inevitable bias. They sought to catalogue physical traits, measure height and proportions, record peculiar behaviors, and understand patterns of reproduction and kinship. Yet even with this more systematic approach, data remained inconsistent. The family's cooperation was limited, interactions were carefully managed, and the researcher's presence itself could alter behavior. Despite these challenges, early anthropologists were struck by what they perceived as the extreme consequences of isolation and repeated intermarriage within a closed group. Striking similarities among individuals, unusual health conditions recurring across generations, and behavioral patterns that suggested both adaptation and rigidity. Some accounts describe particularly dramatic encounters. Officials reported arriving at the family's home only to find it eerily empty, the occupants hidden or observing silently from the surrounding woods. Children would appear at the edges of paths, vanishing before they could be approached. Adults sometimes greeted outsiders with intense scrutiny, evaluating intentions with expressions that were difficult to read and, at times, intimidating in their intensity. These interactions conveyed both the family's wariness and their capacity for strategic control. They allowed limited observation but ensured that critical knowledge, such as exact genealogy, health conditions, and household dynamics, remained concealed. Even early scientists, accustomed to systematic study, expressed frustration and fascination, recognizing that their subjects existed almost entirely beyond the reach of conventional documentation. The family's interactions with officials also revealed an acute awareness of the power dynamics inherent in contact with outsiders. Visitors were often carefully managed, their access controlled to ensure the family's privacy and security. Children were taught when to retreat and how to observe without revealing internal routines. Adults acted as gatekeepers, allowing only essential exchanges and minimizing opportunities for detailed observation. In this sense, the family demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of social strategy, using both environment and behavior to maintain autonomy. For officials accustomed to exerting authority, these interactions were both confounding and disquieting. The household was not merely surviving in isolation, it was actively shaping how it was perceived, manipulating even the most cautious and observant outsiders. Observers were frequently struck by the duality of responses they elicited from the family. On one hand, there was remarkable cooperation. Provisions were offered, questions were answered, and basic interactions facilitated the survival of all parties. On the other, there was extreme caution, bordering on hostility, particularly when outsiders pressed beyond acceptable limits. Visitors described moments of uncanny coordination among family members, children signaling to one another with subtle gestures, adults moving in ways that maintained both control and distance, and a general sense that every action was deliberate. These behaviors, interpreted through the lens of 19th-century ethnography, were seen as evidence of both adaptation and anomaly, confirming the family's reputation as extraordinary in both physical and social terms. The family's secrecy extended to information about reproduction, health, and internal hierarchy. Even when officials and scientists were allowed to enter the household, data were fragmentary and sometimes misleading. Births were rarely acknowledged, marriages obscured, and deaths recorded only internally. Observers could note patterns but could not confirm them definitively. This opacity reinforced the family's mystique, ensuring that every account contained both fact and speculation. Reports of recurring physical traits, behavioral rigidity, and social cohesion were documented meticulously, yet the absence of corroborating records left a persistent uncertainty. In a sense, the family controlled its own narrative, allowing the world to see them in fragments while safeguarding the most critical details of their existence. Some anthropologists attempted to reconcile these observations with emerging theories of heredity and isolation, comparing the family to other known cases of isolated populations in Europe and beyond. While the scientific framework of the time was limited, early researchers recognized the family as a living experiment in extreme genetic and social isolation. Patterns of resemblance, health conditions, and behavior were analyzed as evidence of how isolation and consanguinity could shape an entire lineage. Even in this early scientific context, the family's story defied simple categorization, existing at the intersection of biology, culture, and legend. What emerges from these encounters is a portrait of a family that was not merely a subject of curiosity, but an active participant in shaping how it was understood. Outsiders could observe, record, and theorize, but the family's deliberate secrecy and strategic behavior ensured that control remained firmly in their hands. Every interaction was a negotiation, balancing survival, secrecy, and the unavoidable intrusion of outsiders. In this way, the family exemplifies a rare combination of biological isolation within the hidden valleys of the Carpathians. The internal life of the family was a carefully orchestrated balance of authority, expectation, and survival. Social dynamics were tightly regulated, with older members exercising unquestioned control over younger generations, ensuring that each person understood their role within the household from an early age. Children were trained not only in practical skills, hunting, gathering, cooking, but also in the subtle arts of observation, anticipation, and obedience. Every movement, every gesture, even the tone of one's voice, carried significance, reinforcing a system of internal order that allowed the family to function seamlessly despite the harsh and isolated environment. Outsiders frequently noted the eerie synchronicity with which family members coordinated tasks, a cohesion that seemed almost instinctual, as though each individual could sense the intentions and needs of the others without explicit communication. Psychological pressures were equally profound. Isolation amplified both the unity and the intensity of relationships within the household. Emotional bonds were strong but strictly codified. Affection and protection were reserved for family members, while any interaction with outsiders was met with caution or wariness. Repeated intermarriage created an additional layer of interdependence, binding individuals not only socially but genetically. The family's awareness of its own uniqueness, combined with the external perception of them as strange or cursed, further reinforced a culture of secrecy and conformity. This environment demanded resilience, vigilance, and adaptability, shaping behaviors that were at once highly functional and deeply unsettling to those who observed them. Conflict within the household, when it occurred, was rarely public. Disputes were managed internally, with older members mediating or enforcing resolution according to long-standing family rules. Even punishment followed a system that outsiders could only speculate about, measured, purposeful, and aimed at preserving the stability of the unit rather than merely venting anger. In this way, psychological stress and social control were intertwined, ensuring that the family's internal cohesion remained unbroken despite generations of isolation. The result was a microcosm of society operating under its own logic, where behavior, hierarchy, and survival were inseparable. Children grew up intensely aware of the stakes of their environment, internalizing patterns of discipline, loyalty, and vigilance that were essential to both survival and identity. To outsiders, this could appear as rigidity, strangeness, or even eeriness, but within the household, these traits were adaptive, providing stability and continuity in a world that was otherwise harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving.